October 1983. Under a churning, slate-grey sky, 300 feet beneath the icy surface of the Barents Sea, Captain Second-Rank Mikhail Petrov of the Soviet Red Banner Northern Fleet felt the familiar thrum of his command. The submarine, K-496, a Delta III-class ballistic missile boat, was the pride of the Soviet Navy and the shield of the motherland. It carried 16 R-29R missiles, each capable of delivering multiple nuclear warheads to the heart of the American eastern seaboard. Petrov was a guardian of Armageddon, a ghost in the water, and he moved with the supreme confidence of a man who believed he was utterly alone. The Americans, his political officers assured him, were loud. Their submarines were powerful but unsophisticated, industrial brutes that announced their presence with a cacophony of machinery, noise, and cavitation. Soviet sonar technology, they were taught, was more attuned to the subtle acoustics of the Arctic deep. Here, in their strategic bastion, their home waters, they were the hunters. They were invincible. Petrov walked through the dimly lit control room, the air thick with the smell of recycled air, ozone from the electronics, and the faint scent of black bread from the galley. The soft green glow of the sonar station illuminated the face of a young Mickman, his brow furrowed in concentration, his headphones pressed tightly against his ears. "Status?" Petrov asked, his voice a low rumble. The sailor looked up, his eyes clear. "The ocean is quiet, Comrade Captain. Nothing but shrimp and ice." Petrov nodded. It was as it should be. But procedure was procedure. The Americans, for all their clumsiness, were persistent. It was time for the ritual that every Soviet submarine commander knew as intimately as his own child's face: the crazy Ivan. It was a sudden, hard rudder turn, a complete circle designed to clear the baffles, the blind spot directly behind the submarine where a trailing enemy could hide, masked by the noise of their own screws. "Helm, right full rudder," Petrov commanded. "Execute maneuver." The massive 10,000-ton submarine began to heel over, groaning as its hull fought against the immense pressure of the deep. In the sonar room, the Mickman listened intently, his senses strained to detect the slightest anomaly. A trailing American sub, caught by surprise, would be forced to maneuver frantically to avoid a collision, betraying its position with a burst of noise. The seconds stretched into a minute. The submarine completed its turn. The Mickman pulled one side of his headphones off, shaking his head. "Clear, Comrade Captain. The baffles are empty. We are alone." A thin smile touched Petrov's lips. The shield was secure. The ghost remained a ghost. He gave the order to resume course, to push further out into the deep Arctic Channel before turning south towards the Atlantic. What Captain Petrov never knew, what the sonarman couldn't hear, and what the entire Soviet Admiralty refused to believe was possible, was that less than 1,000 yards behind him, the sleek, black teardrop hull of the USS Hyman G. Rickover, a Los Angeles-class fast-attack submarine, had perfectly matched his turn. Its own S-6G nuclear reactor was so quiet it was practically undetectable, its machinery resting on a complex system of sound-dampening rafts. Its crew, listening through a BQQ-5 spherical sonar array 100 times more sensitive than its Soviet counterpart, had heard the K-496 begin its turn before Petrov's own helmsman had finished repeating the order. They hadn't needed to scramble. They had anticipated, adjusted, and remained perfectly positioned in the Delta's wake, a silent, unseen predator clinging to the shadow of its prey. The American submarine was a hole in the water, an absence of sound, and it would remain there, unheard and unsuspected, for the next 67 days. If you want to understand the hidden history of the Cold War and how battles were won in complete silence, make sure to subscribe to WW2 Impact. To the men like Mikhail Petrov, this scenario was not just impossible, it was a violation of the laws of nature as they understood them. The entire strategic doctrine of the Soviet Union rested on the survivability of its submarine-based nuclear deterrent. From the massive naval bases of the Kola Peninsula, a stream of metal leviathans, typhoons, deltas, aculas, slipped into the Arctic gloom, their mission to disappear and provide the ultimate guarantee that any attack on the motherland would be met with absolute annihilation. Soviet propaganda posters depicted their submariners as stoic heroes, masters of the deep. Newsreels showed missiles breaking the ocean surface in thunderous displays of power. The message was clear: the Soviet submarine fleet was the most advanced, the most silent, and the most deadly force beneath the waves. Their admirals and designers had poured immense resources into a single-minded goal: acoustic superiority. They pioneered double-hull designs for survivability, developed massive 7-bladed propellers to reduce cavitation, and coated their most advanced boats in sound-absorbing rubber tiles. They believed, with the conviction of faith, that they were winning the technology race in the one area that mattered most: stealth. They knew their reactors were louder than the Americans, but they believed their hull designs and propeller technology gave them an edge, a sound signature that was quieter and harder to detect. They were stunned when they learned the truth. They couldn't believe what American ingenuity had accomplished in the dark. This belief system was shattered by a reality born decades earlier in the mind of one of the most ruthless and brilliant engineers in American history, Admiral Hyman G. Rickover. The father of the nuclear navy, Rickover was a man pathologically obsessed with perfection, reliability, and one other, overriding principle: silence. He understood that in the deep ocean, sound was everything. Speed was irrelevant if you could be heard coming from 50 miles away. Firepower was useless if you were destroyed before you could launch. From the very beginning of the nuclear submarine program, Rickover drove his engineers and contractors with a relentless fury, demanding that every pipe, every pump, every rotating piece of machinery be designed not just for performance, but for silence. The result was a design philosophy utterly alien to the Soviets. While the Russians focused on brute force, bigger boats, bigger missiles, deeper diving depths, the Americans pursued a fanatical devotion to acoustic stealth. The teardrop hull of the USS Albacore, the development of natural circulation reactors that could run with their main coolant pumps shut down, the placement of entire engine rooms on massive, vibration-absorbing platforms called rafts. Every innovation had a single purpose: to erase the submarine's presence from the ocean. The culmination of this obsession was the Los Angeles class. When the first boat, the USS Los Angeles, SSN 688, was launched in 1976, it represented a quantum leap in submarine technology. It was not just a weapons platform, it was an integrated system of stealth and sensors. Its heart was the BQQ-5 sonar system, a massive spherical array built into the bow that could listen to the ocean with unparalleled clarity, its data processed by computers that were light years ahead of anything the Soviets possessed. This was paired with a towed array sonar, a cable miles long trailing behind the sub, studded with hydrophones that could detect the faintest whispers of a distant enemy. The Americans had understood a fundamental truth that the Soviets had missed. It wasn't just about making your own ship quiet. It was about making your listening ability so sensitive that the enemy's quiet sounded like a symphony of noise. The unspoken policy of the US submarine force was not merely to patrol the oceans, but to own them. Their mission was to go deep into the enemy's most heavily defended waters, the so-called bastions of the Barents Sea and the Sea of Okhotsk, and tail every single Soviet ballistic missile submarine from the moment it left port. It was a strategy of breathtaking audacity, a silent, undeclared war fought in the crushing blackness of the abyss, and the Soviets never even knew it was happening. They were defending against a brute force attack they expected, completely unaware that an invisible enemy was already inside their house, listening to their every breath. The arrogance of the Soviet Navy reached its zenith in the mid-1980s with the launch of the Project 971, the submarine known to NATO as the Akula class. This was their masterpiece, a vessel designed with the specific purpose of hunting and killing American Los Angeles-class submarines. Soviet naval architects had finally acknowledged some of their acoustic deficiencies and had thrown everything they had at the problem. The Akula featured a distinctive limo, a pod on its rudder that housed a passive towed sonar array, a direct copy of the American system. Its machinery was mounted on advanced sound-dampening blocks, and its huge, highly skewed propellers were milled with a precision previously unseen in Soviet shipyards. The first intelligence reports reaching Washington were sobering. The Akula was quiet, dangerously quiet. The Soviets believed they had finally achieved parity, if not superiority. Aboard the K-317 Pantera, one of the first Akulas to enter service, Captain First Rank Vladimir Zemskov felt a surge of pride. His vessel was the apex predator, the culmination of Soviet ingenuity. His orders were to hunt, to find one of the American fast attacks that so brazenly patrolled the edges of their waters, and to prove that the balance of power had shifted. For weeks, Zemskov prowled the Norwegian Sea, a stretch of water known to submariners as the playground. It was a known hunting ground for both sides. He pushed his crew, running complex search patterns, his sonar officers listening with obsessive focus for the signature of an S-6G reactor. But they heard nothing. Zemskov interpreted this silence as a victory. The Americans, he concluded, were finally showing a healthy fear. They knew the Akula was out here, and they were staying away. They were running scared from the new master of the deep. On one occasion, his senior sonar officer reported a faint, intermittent contact, a whisper at the very edge of perception. Zemskov came to the sonar station himself, listening through the headphones. He heard it, a faint, rhythmic swishing sound. He consulted the acoustic library. "Biologicals," he declared with confidence. "A pod of whales. The Americans are nowhere to be found. They know we are here." He ordered the contact ignored and logged it as marine life. His crew relaxed, their confidence bolstered by their captain's certainty. Zemskov was sure he had proven his point. He returned to his home port of Gadzievo with a clean log, reporting that American submarine activity in the sector was non-existent, likely deterred by the presence of his superior vessel. He was praised for his successful patrol, a testament to the power of the new Akula. The shock came 2 months later, not in the chaos of battle, but in the sterile quiet of a high-security debriefing room at the headquarters of the Northern Fleet. Zemskov stood before a panel of grim-faced admirals. He had just finished his report, detailing his assessment of American cowardice. The fleet commander, a man with a face like carved granite, slid a folder across the polished table. "Open it, Captain." Zemskov's hands were steady. He expected a commendation. Inside was a single, 8 by 10 glossy photograph. It was black and white, slightly grainy, but the image was horrifyingly clear. It was a photograph of the stern of his own submarine, the K-317 Pantera. The unique 7-bladed propeller was perfectly framed. The distinctive sonar pod on the rudder was unmistakable. The photograph was taken from directly behind and slightly above, from a distance so close he could almost count the rivets on the hull. But it was the object in the foreground that made the blood freeze in his veins. At the bottom of the frame, clear as day, was the curved black bow and forward sail of an American Los Angeles-class submarine. The admirals were shocked, but Zemskov felt a deeper, more personal horror. He remembered the faint swishing sound his sonarman had reported, the sound he had dismissed as a whale. It wasn't a whale. It was the sound of an American periscope cutting through the water less than 500 yards behind him. The Americans hadn't been scared. They hadn't been absent. They had been there the entire time, so close they could take a family portrait. The silence in the room was absolute. It was the silence of a tomb. Zemskov stared at the photograph, his mind struggling to process the implications. His perfect, invisible predator had been the prey. His hunt had been a joke. His entire patrol, he had been nothing more than a dumb animal being led on a leash by an unseen master. The admirals couldn't believe what they were seeing. This single photograph was an indictment of everything they thought they knew. It meant their multi-billion-ruble Akula program was a failure before it had even truly begun. It meant their most secure strategic bastions were as transparent as glass to the Americans. It meant their sonar was deaf, their tactics were obsolete, and their understanding of underwater warfare was a generation behind. The initial mockery of the loud Americans, the confident assertions of Soviet superiority, all of it evaporated in the stark reality of that one impossible picture. A wave of disbelief washed over the room, followed by a cold, sickening dread. They were not the hunters, they were the hunted. And the most terrifying part was that the enemy was so good, so silent, that they had never, ever heard them coming. The ocean was not their sanctuary, it was an American lake. And they had been swimming in it, fat and blind, for years. The photograph that shattered Captain Zemskov's career was not a fluke, not a lucky shot from a single, audacious American captain. It was evidence of a systematic, relentless, and undeclared campaign of acoustic dominance that had become the standard operating procedure for the entire US submarine force. The admirals in Moscow were stunned because they were seeing the end result of a strategy they never knew existed. To the American sailors of the Silent Service, this was just another day at the office. The mission, known colloquially as Holy Stone or simply picket duty, was brutally simple in its objective and fantastically complex in its execution. Find every Soviet boomer, attach a Los Angeles-class submarine to its tail the moment it left port, and do not let go. Ever. This wasn't a series of isolated encounters. It was a vast, silent dragnet thrown over the two most critical naval bastions in the Soviet Union, the Kola Peninsula in the Barents Sea and the Kamchatka Peninsula in the Pacific. At any given moment, multiple American fast attacks were on station, waiting in the deep, cold channels for their assigned target to emerge. The goal was to ensure that if the Cold War ever turned hot, the primary Soviet nuclear deterrent would be eliminated within the first 5 minutes of the conflict, before a single missile could ever be launched. The sheer technological disparity made this possible even in the most challenging environments on Earth. Consider the Strait of Gibraltar, the narrow choke point connecting the Atlantic to the Mediterranean. It was a chaotic soup of sound. Supertankers, fishing trawlers, freighters, and multiple navies all churned the waters into a deafening roar. Soviet commanders of Victor III-class hunter-killer submarines, transiting from the Black Sea, felt a sense of security in this noise. They believed the cacophony would mask their presence, allowing them to slip through undetected. Aboard the USS Bremerton, however, this noise was not a problem. It was a dataset. The Bremerton's BQQ-5 sonar, coupled with its powerful AN divided by BQQ-6 towed array, didn't just hear the noise, it analyzed it. Its advanced computers, programmed with thousands of acoustic signatures, acted like a filter, subtracting the known sounds of every tanker and fishing boat, identifying the unique flow of water over the Rock of Gibraltar, and isolating the one signature that mattered, the faint, specific hum of the Victor's turbine generators and the unique frequency of its twin propellers. The Soviet captain, confident he was hidden in the crowd, never knew that an American submarine was tucked in less than half a mile behind him, using the noise of a passing freighter to mask its own slight adjustments in speed and depth. The Americans weren't just navigating the ocean, they were reading it like a musical score, able to pick out the one wrong note in a deafening orchestra. The Soviet sub was a ghost to everyone else, but to the Bremerton, it glowed like a flare in the darkness. Nowhere was this American dominance more shockingly demonstrated than in the frozen hellscape of the Arctic Ocean. The Soviets considered the ice pack their ultimate sanctuary. They built the largest submarines ever conceived, the gargantuan Typhoon class, specifically to operate there. These 48,000-ton behemoths could smash through meters of ice to launch their 20 ballistic missiles from the relative safety of the polar cap. They were convinced no American submarine would dare to follow them into this treacherous, uncharted labyrinth. The risks were astronomical. The ice keels, some plunging thousands of feet deep, could rip a hull open in seconds. Navigation was a nightmare, with magnetic compasses spinning uselessly so close to the pole and satellite fixes impossible beneath the ice. The ambient noise of the shifting, grinding ice pack could confuse even the most advanced sonar. The Soviets believed they were completely alone, safe in their frozen fortress. They never knew about the USS Tautog and the USS Sturgeon. These were not just submarines, they were specialized instruments of Arctic warfare. Outfitted with upward-facing sonar to map the ice canopy above them, inertial navigation systems that could operate for weeks without an external fix, and crews trained in the terrifying art of under-ice maneuvering, they did the impossible. They followed the typhoons. American captains would trail a typhoon for weeks on end, navigating a three-dimensional maze of moving ice, their world a constant twilight of sonar screens and the eerie groans of the ice pack pressing in around them. The American sonar operators became so attuned to this environment that they could distinguish the sound of their target from the sound of a cracking ice floe or a distant underwater avalanche. While the Soviet crew aboard their Typhoon enjoyed the false confidence of total isolation, an American crew, a few thousand yards away, was silently logging their every move, noting their patrol patterns, and keeping a targeting solution constantly updated. The Soviets were stunned to later learn that the Americans had not only followed them, but had also surfaced in small pockets of open water, or polinyas, to send back intelligence reports, sometimes within miles of their quarry. The ice hadn't been a shield, it had been a coffin, and the Americans had been holding the lid. For the Soviet sonarmen, the experience was psychologically devastating. They were trained to listen for things, the beat of a propeller, the whine of a turbine, the ping of active sonar. But the American Los Angeles-class submarine became a symbol of something far more terrifying, the absence of sound. It was a hole in the water, a void where something should be. Veteran Soviet submariners would talk in hushed tones of phantom contacts, faint, inexplicable acoustic disturbances that would appear and then vanish, leaving them questioning their own senses and equipment. They were chasing ghosts because the true threat was something they couldn't even perceive. This symbol, this silent void, represented the horrifying truth. The Americans hadn't just built a quieter submarine, they had weaponized silence itself. They had created a predator so perfectly adapted to its environment that for all intents and purposes, it did not exist until the moment it fired its torpedoes. The Soviet Navy had spent decades building a shield, only to discover their enemy was an invisible phantom who had been standing behind it the entire time. The slow, creeping realization that their underwater fleet was not just vulnerable but fundamentally obsolete sent a shockwave through the highest echelons of the Soviet military. The initial reaction from the main naval staff in Moscow was disbelief, followed by furious denial. Captain Zemskov's incident was initially classified as an isolated intelligence failure, perhaps a traitor on his crew, or a lucky break for the Americans. The Admirals, many of whom had built their entire careers on the myth of Soviet naval might, simply couldn't believe that a technological gap of such magnitude could exist. It contradicted every intelligence report, every 5-year plan, and every piece of propaganda they had so carefully constructed. They had invested the equivalent of hundreds of billions of dollars, sacrificing domestic needs to build what they believed was the world's most formidable submarine force. To admit it was all a lie was to admit a catastrophic failure of the Soviet system itself. Their first response was not to innovate, but to clamp down. A wave of paranoia swept through the Northern and Pacific fleets. Political officers conducted interrogations. Crews were scrutinized for any sign of disloyalty, and security around the naval bases was tightened to an almost comical degree. They were looking for spies, for traitors who were leaking patrol routes and schedules to the Americans. They simply could not accept that the Americans didn't need spies. They had sonar. The High Command issued a series of increasingly desperate orders. Submarine commanders were instructed to perform more frequent and more aggressive Crazy Ivan maneuvers. Some were ordered to execute complex, unpredictable underwater acrobatics, diving and turning at random intervals, believing they could shake any potential tail. Other tactics involved sprinting at flank speed for a period, and then suddenly shutting down all non-essential machinery, hoping a trailing sub would rush past them. They even attempted to use their own hunter-killer submarines as escorts for the ballistic missile boats, creating small wolf packs they hoped could detect and destroy any American shadow. Every single countermeasure failed, and in many cases made the situation worse. The aggressive maneuvers consumed vast amounts of fuel, drastically reducing patrol times and putting immense strain on the hulls and reactors. More importantly, they were loud. An Akula submarine performing a high-speed sprint and sudden stop created a massive acoustic event, a burst of noise that was instantly detected by the listening American submarine. The US captain didn't have to scramble. They simply slowed down, let the Soviet sub perform its noisy tantrum, and then quietly reacquired the target once it resumed its course. The escort tactic was equally useless. An American Los Angeles class, with its superior sonar, could detect the entire Soviet wolfpack long before any of them could detect it. The US sub would then simply position itself in the acoustic blind spot of the most logical threat, often using the noise of one Soviet sub to mask its presence from another. The Soviets were trying to play checkers, while the Americans were playing three-dimensional chess in complete darkness. The psychological impact on the Soviet submariners was the most devastating blow. These men were the elite of the Soviet military, subjected to a grueling selection process and indoctrinated with a sense of their own technological superiority. That confidence, once shattered, gave way to a pervasive and corrosive fear. The deep ocean, once their sanctuary, now felt like a coffin lined with unseen eyes. The absolute silence between sonar sweeps became terrifying, filled with the imagined presence of an enemy they could not hear. A normal creak of the hull under pressure could send a jolt of adrenaline through the control room. A sonarman reporting a faint biological would be met with suspicious, terrified glances. Was it a whale, or was it the Americans, mocking them again? Crews on long patrols became irritable and paranoid. The constant tension of being hunted by an invisible enemy wore them down. They lost faith in their equipment and, more importantly, they lost faith in their commanders and the system that had lied to them. Veteran acoustic warfare officers, men who could once identify a NATO frigate by the specific pitch of its gearbox from 20 miles away, now felt like children lost in the woods. Their skills were useless against an enemy that made no sound. They began to refer to the American fast attacks with a grim, fearful respect, calling them 10 or the Shadow. A story, likely apocryphal but widely believed, circulated through the fleet about a Soviet Delta IV captain who, after a grueling 70-day patrol filled with phantom contacts, suffered a complete mental breakdown, convinced the Americans had somehow attached a listening device directly to his hull. The crushing weight of their own technological inferiority was breaking them. They were the proud guardians of the apocalypse, reduced to a state of constant, nerve-shredding anxiety, forever listening for a sound that would never come. The Los Angeles-class submarine was not merely a superior piece of military hardware. It was the inevitable product of a superior system of thought, production, and innovation. The Soviet admirals, who stared in horror at photographs of their most advanced submarines being tailed, couldn't believe what they were seeing because they were trying to comprehend a result without understanding the vast, invisible ecosystem that created it. The silence of an American submarine was not an isolated engineering feat. It was the sound of an entire society's technological and industrial philosophy made manifest. It was the sound of Silicon Valley's burgeoning computer power, which allowed sonar systems to process acoustic data with a complexity the Soviets could only dream of. It was the sound of a competitive, decentralized industrial base, where companies like General Dynamics' Electric Boat were driven by relentless perfectionism, not state-mandated quotas. It was the sound of an empowered naval culture, forged by Hyman Rickover, that gave immense autonomy and responsibility to its submarine commanders, trusting them to operate independently for months on end in the most hostile environments imaginable. The Soviet system, for all its might, was a brittle, top-down pyramid. It could replicate, it could scale up, but it could not innovate at the same pace. And in the deep ocean, the race was not to the biggest, but to the quietest. The Soviet Union had built an industrial sledgehammer only to find itself in a fight that required a scalpel. The ultimate humiliating demonstration of this systemic failure was not a battle, but a business transaction. By the late 1980 seconds, the Soviet leadership, finally accepting the terrifying acoustic gap, became desperate. Their own research labs and design bureaus had failed to create the tools needed to machine propellers with the complex multi-axis curves required for true acoustic stealth. Their finest engineers could design the propellers on paper, but their manufacturing base could not physically produce them. So, in an act of breathtaking ideological surrender, they went shopping. Through a series of front companies and clandestine deals, the KGB orchestrated the illegal purchase of 2 9-axis, computer-controlled milling machines from the Toshiba Machine Company of Japan, and the advanced numerical controllers to run them from the Norwegian state-owned company Kongsberg Våpenfabrik. These were not weapons, they were the tools that create the weapons. They were the crown jewels of Western manufacturing technology, capable of carving massive blocks of metal into sophisticated shapes with a precision measured in micrometers. For a brief, terrifying period, the plan worked. New Soviet submarines, particularly the improved Akula II class, began sliding into the ocean with propellers of a quality they had never possessed before, and they were quiet. Suddenly, dramatically quiet. American submarines on patrol in the Atlantic began reporting that contacts they had been tracking for years were suddenly vanishing from their sonar screens. The comfortable acoustic advantage the U.S. Navy had enjoyed for a generation was eroding, seemingly overnight. There was a palpable sense of alarm in the Pentagon. Had the Soviets finally achieved a technological breakthrough? Had their system, against all odds, produced a miracle? The truth, when it was finally uncovered by intelligence services, was far more damning for Moscow. The Soviet Union's great leap forward in stealth was not the product of their own ingenuity. It was a product of Japanese and Norwegian engineering, paid for with hard currency. The pride of the Red Banner fleet, the silent shield of the socialist ideal, was running on stolen capitalist technology. The scandal, when it broke, was immense. But for the men in the Kremlin, the public embarrassment was nothing compared to the private shame. Their system had failed so completely that to protect itself, it had been forced to secretly feed at the trough of its sworn enemy. They had built a Potemkin village of naval power, impressive from a distance but fundamentally hollow on the inside. The Cold War did not end with a bang. It ended with a whimper, with the quiet rusting of a silent fleet that its nation could no longer afford to send to sea. In the years after the collapse of the Soviet Union, American naval officers began to meet their former adversaries at conferences. The stories they heard were astonishing. They learned that Russian sonar operators, in a desperate attempt to hear the American submarines they knew were there, would sometimes turn off their own electronic filters, flooding their headsets with the raw, chaotic sound of the ocean, hoping to catch a whisper of evidence in the static. They listened, straining their ears in the dark, for an enemy whose defining characteristic was that he could not be heard. They were listening for a ghost. The final verdict was written not in treaties but in technology. The Soviet ideology, built on the promise of industrial and social perfection, was ultimately defeated by a system that was more adaptable, more innovative, and fundamentally more creative. It was a system that could design a submarine so acoustically invisible that the only way its enemy could ever hope to match it was to buy the machines that built it. The great contest of the 20th century was decided in the silent, crushing dark, 300 feet beneath the waves. It was won not by the side with the most missiles, but by the side that understood that in the modern age, true power doesn't make a sound.